Yay. All right. I'm going to share some slides that I prepared. All right. So as you can tell, we're a little bit informal here, but it is my honor and privilege to introduce RJ Andrews, who is a data storyteller. And I don't think, RJ, we haven't met. Like, I don't think we've ever met.
Not like this.
Okay. So I'm really thrilled to meet you, and actually I think I didn't realize that I'd known this about you, but I think I was doing some checking on, like, doing some research on Florence Nightingale, I think, and I ran across an infographic that you created. And I'm pretty sure it's yours, right? Where you have like a history of infographics. I mean, it's like an infographic itself, and you can click on it, and it's like this historical map.
Yeah, we can share that if we wanted to.
Okay, that would be fabulous. And I didn't know, I didn't make the connection with you. You know, Howard Weiner kind of introduced us, but and then I thought, oh wow, I know Info We Trust. So so I was really happy to have this connection with you. So if I can get my slide to move, there we go. So today's webinar is sponsored by several groups. First is Chance Magazine, which is a publication of the American Statistical Association. Donna Lalonde and I are co-editors of Chance Magazine, and we're so happy that this is our first webinar that we're hosting that will have a connection with Chance, and in the future, we're hoping to have more of these where they're webinars given by authors of articles in Chance. And we're proud that and happy to have RJ, who wrote an article that will be published in the next issue, the September issue of Chance, on Emma Willard. And we'll hear more about Emma, I'm sure, today. Also, the History of Statistics Interest Group. And then finally, our Govies are both sponsoring today's webinar. So as I said, Donna and I are co-editors of Chance Magazine. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to let you know about a contest that we have going on. And it's called Pixel by Pixel, The Art of Chance. And so Donna and I are challenging all of you to channel your inner artist and to create an artwork that involves some aspect of randomness, which is also called generative art. So if you go to amstat.org, you'll see this on the banner, and I think you can click on it and it will take you to information about the contest. So hopefully we'll have some nice artwork submitted by people here today, and we'll have entries and winners featured in a future issue of Chance.
So Wendy, I put the link in the chat, and then maybe we can just remind folks that if they have questions, they can put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and you and I will monitor that.
Thank you very much. I totally forgot that. Yes, please do that. And RJ is willing and happy to have a little bit of a dialogue, even though you can't unmute yourselves, but you can enter it in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll monitor it, and we'll interrupt RJ. We're grateful that this is being recorded. We are going to post it to the R Govies YouTube channel. I'll put a link to that in the chat. Please subscribe. See, we only have 2 subscribers right now, but maybe we'll get some more subscribers after today. So please check that out. So I'm very happy to introduce RJ, who is a practicing data storyteller. He helps organizations solve high stakes problems by using visual metaphors and information graphics. He recently produced designs for the White House and MIT. RJ's first original artwork was an elevation map of California created on an antique typewriter. And RJ, I hope you're going to say a little bit about how you did that, because I've been trying to think about how you could do something like that. And if you could show us, that would be, like the artwork, that would be fantastic.
Oh, sure.
Great, thanks. Because this was just acquired by the David Rumsey Map Collection for Stanford University. As we'll find out today, RJ's passion is studying the history of information graphics. He published Information Graphics, Graphic Visionaries, which is a new book series celebrating 3 spectacular data visualization creators. Emma Willard, Florence Nightingale, and E.J. Murray. Did I say his name right?
Beautifully said.
Yay, okay. Each volume has new writing, complete visual catalogs, and discoveries never seen by the public. The books, which RJ will discuss today, are available from Visionary Press. And Donna and I both have the 3 books, and I have to say they are just beautiful. I think they're works of art in and of themselves. So please check them out. They're very high quality. And I know you're going to learn a lot from the books as well as from today's talk. So I'm going to stop sharing and then pass it to you, RJ. So thank you.
Howdy, everybody. So there's old business and new business, and it seems like we have a couple pieces of old business to address before we get to the new business, which is the books and the stories. So very quick, I'll do shout outs to a couple of peripheral projects. One is a interactive information graphic that I made 7 or 8 years ago, and this was actually my entry into the world of the history of data visualization. It's based largely on the Milestones projects by Michael Friendly. And the idea is that you can see this timeline strip, and you can see at least, what was to me back then, 8 years ago, kind of all the big milestones. And of course, since then I've learned quite a lot. But what's fun is that you have these cartoons, and you can pick one of these cartoons, select it, and you can see this highlight and see the real thing, learn just a little bit about it, and have a source where you can go learn more. And of course, the spotlight goes along the strip map. And what's really amazing about this is that 7 or 8 years later, it still works. Okay, so this is at history.infowetrust.com. And if you want a real crash course entry into the history of data visualization, you can visit history.infowetrust.com. I will put that, or if somebody could put that into the chat, that would be great. History.infowetrust.com. Okay, the other thing that was mentioned is my latest typewriter mapping. And so this is my typewriter map. It was made in a 1953 Royal Quiet Deluxe typewriter. And how I'm doing this is I'm using over typing. And so the characters, if we go down here, let's see if we see this image a little bit bigger. Yeah, there we go. And so here, if we look at David Rumsey's scan of the map, what you can see is you can actually see how the different letters are overtyped. And so behind the scenes, you have a bunch of GIS work, taking DEM data and then binning it and quantizing it and trying to figure out exactly how to represent California and its beautiful landforms, and not just landforms, but land flows. Using this insanely constrained media. Okay, so here is the typewriter map. I wrote about this, and you can see more about this on my newsletter, which is, again, here's another link for somebody to put into the chat. It's at charts.substack.com. And the newsletter's title is Chartography. Okay, so that is the 2 pieces of old business, but we have some new business. Okay, so let's go to new business. And can we see this okay?
Yes, I can see
Great.
it.
Okay, so the new business is this trilogy of books. about 3 people, 1 volume per person, who did really spectacular things with information graphics. And we're going to talk about, I think we're going to touch on all 3. Each of them have not only beautiful designs, but beautiful stories. We can't get to everything. And so what I prefer is during our hour together is that if you want to put questions in the chat, and then I can be interrupted and respond directly to them. But I'm going to kick things off by addressing one topic of interest that I was asked to talk about. And here's the paper that Howard and I published in Chance on one of the volumes, Florence Nightingale. So yes, this is a book talk. You know, I'm hawking books. You can get the books at visionarypress.com. They're spectacular. We only printed so many. Printed in Italy. When they're gone, they're going to be gone. Okay, but what I was asked to talk about was data, and particularly the role of government data in the development of statistics and the development of information graphics. And so I want to begin by actually not talking about one of these 3 visionaries, but talk about a man who appears in the Nightingale volume, and his name is André Michel Guéry. And hopefully Howard Weiner, who I know is on the call, is I hope that he's smiling that we're beginning with Guéry. But Guéry, you know, basically he was a lawyer in Paris, and as a lawyer, he had kind of an early crack at all of this new judicial data that was being published by the French government. And so this is in the mid 1820s, about 200 years ago. And what's really fantastic is that the government was publishing data. This isn't something that governments traditionally did, because we are all sort of, you know, all of our careers have somehow wound up in this crazy field of statistics. What are statistics? Well, the root word is right there, the state, right? These are facts and figures of the state. And for a long time, there were mostly secret facts and figures. And so you have, you know, how much grain does the state produce, and how many soldiers can the state field? You know, population, the wealth of the empire, and slowly, you know, through church records and then insurance companies, you know, statistics sort of leak out into the public sphere. And at the beginning of the 19th century, the French government started publishing these statistics. And in the following decade, the British government would follow suit. And then the way I see it is that the Americans kind of followed them, especially immediately after our Civil War. But Guéry was there when it all started in the 1820s. And he not only read these statistics, but he tried to make some sense of them. And how did he make sense of them? Well, back in the 1820s, you didn't have widespread use of all statistical tools that we rely on today, like, I don't know, regression or correlation. You know, maybe these things were bubbling out there, but they weren't widely adopted, widely practiced. And so what people did is they made pictures. And so if you wanted to see, you know, education levels of France, you might color a map like this, and you might key the shading of the different districts of France to different education levels. And so that's what Guéry did. And in fact, this is the first what we call a choropleth map that we know of, and we celebrate it. And immediately he not only did this, but he started doing the second thing, which we did. Not only do we make statistics visual, but we enable comparison. So here we have comparisons across districts. That's interesting. But it's even more interesting when you do multiple maps together and you're able to compare education levels to property crime and to violent crime. So Guéry is doing this, and basically he and, you know, some of his other sort of early collaborators, colleagues, competitors, what they're doing is they are mapping whatever data they have, whatever data is out there, because again, the government is just starting to publish data. And so what do they have a lot of data of? They have a lot of data of the weather. And so they're making these, what we now call bar charts or column charts of different meteorological phenomena. And they're looking for patterns. They're trying to compare these things. They're saying, you know, is there a match here? Do these things link up? And so what Guéry is at the very, very, you know, kickstart of is not only criminology, but social science itself. And so this is from a paper in the late 1820s. And what's so fascinating about this paper is, yes, we see, you know, this, you know, rather rote sort of column chart on the left, but we also see these crazy circular diagrams on the right. And I want to pause on these crazy circular diagrams for just a moment, because they're wonderful. And I love them. I really do. And so here we have a set of 4 circular diagrams, and this is, answering the old folk song, which way does the wind blow? Quite literally. And it's using a compass metaphor. We have the 4 seasons, and we see, how many days do we have prevailing winds in one direction or the other. So this is using a compass metaphor. Now, there was another set of circular diagrams just below it, and this is at what time of day are people born? At what time of day do people die? And what's interesting about this is graphically, the image is very, very similar to the one we just saw before. It's these sort of wedges that are arranged around a circle. But, the metaphor is quite different. This isn't a compass metaphor. This is a clock metaphor, right? Okay, so I bring up Gary because, he's at the sort of very foundation of social science, of statistics, of using government data to try to understand what the hell is going on. And then once we understand what's going on, are there places doing better we can learn from? How can we improve, broad society by not looking at individual cases, but looking at the summary, at the overall trends, at the big picture. And that's beautiful. But what's also beautiful is that he's experimenting with visual forms. And so it's this experimentation because, as we all really know now, it's just not enough to have the answer. It's not good enough to be mathematically correct. Like, honestly, that's barely entry. What you really need to do is attract attention to whatever your cause is. And so by experimenting with different forms, you're getting better, perhaps more effective ways at presenting information, ways that not only convey the information better, but attract attention to the information. And that brings us to the first visionary who I want to discuss today, who is Florence Nightingale. And so Florence Nightingale's book looks a little bit like this. Before we dive into it, I'm going to see if we want to pause here and if we want to address any of the Q&A or questions in the chat.
Great, thank you, RJ. I'm glad you paused because I hated to interrupt you. There is a question in the Q&A, but before I ask it, I'm going to ask my question. What was Garay? What was his time period again?
So he was really active for several decades, but this all heats up in about 1826, 1827. The paper comes out in late 1820s, 1829. So this is nearly 200 years ago. But his sort of magnum opus, on comparing British and French statistics comes out, much later in I believe like around 1864 or something like that. So he's active and important for several decades.
That's really amazing what you showed us. And one of the things that I always I guess I'm kind of amazed by is that they did this without computers. And so where the computer can automatically line things up for you and draw it where it's all nice and distributed and accurate and so on. But so I'm just kind of amazed that they did this without those types of tools to
they didn't have digital computers, that's true, but they did have highly skilled draftsmen. They had and there's something special about the computer in that it lets us go very, very quickly in particular directions, very efficiently. But it's actually very hard to be weird with a computer. I know I'm a creative, I do creative stuff, I do creative coding, and it's just very expensive to do anything different with a computer. Whereas if you have a paper and pencil, there's no extra cost to do something different. It's nearly the same cost as doing it the old way. And so the 19th century, which sort of culminates in what some refer to as the golden age of data visualization. Why? Because you have this intersection of not only incredibly important and voluminous data, but also beautiful printing techniques. And just a real zenith before World War I comes and smashes it all to bits. and turns the 20th century into a mechanized brutalism. You have this real zenith of print culture, and so that intersection with data created just spectacular designs. But I'm starting to wander a little bit. The point is that it was mechanized, just not digitally. And we talk about human computers, and we've all sort of learned, I think, about human computers, and there certainly were analysts inside the government, but machine computing comes in, I think, a little bit earlier than we really realize. And so Florence Nightingale, who we're going to talk about, her primary statistical collaborator, William Farr, was using the Schutz calculating engine, which basically made real one of Charles Babbage's designs. He was using that to do complicated calculations. At the same time, he was working with Florence Nightingale in the 1850s. He had a room set up with the second in the world put into service Schutz calculator. The first went to New York and was used on astronomy data, and the second one went to William Farr in London. So yeah, like they didn't have a MacBook Pro, and they didn't have an Amazon server cloud. That's true.
They didn't have Photoshop, right?
Yeah, they didn't have Photoshop. That's true. But that doesn't mean they didn't have databases. It didn't mean that they didn't have armies of people who were, putting this stuff, making this stuff real. And so what I've learned about spending, years with these stories is that they were, that they're not so different from you and I. Yeah.
That's amazing. I have to keep remembering that, because I learned that over and over again, but thank you. Hey, there's one question, a couple questions in the Q&A back to your picture, your map elevation of California. So did you do let me read it. So did you do anything specific to determine the darkness / weight for each character would have when making the map? So for example, mathematically determine the amount of ink used with the space allotted for a character.
Oh yeah. So this is sort of a process. So yeah, quite a lot. So this is, there's many iterations. There's a lot of experimentation. And so the first question is what characters are going to represent your 7 class. So this is a 7 class map, with the bottom class being no mark at all, being blank. And you can see that in the San Francisco Bay, and then other places that are below sea level, such as Death Valley and the Salton Sea. So I have a 7 class map, which means I need 6 marks. How do I determine those marks? I created an enormous variety of combinations of letters with my typewriter, and then I scanned them and I counted the pixels to get some sort of sense of which ones are going to be darker or lighter. So there's a mathematical sort of like analytical machine aspect to the work. But then you actually have to look at all of them and see, like, well, which ones look good together and which ones hang. And so that's sort of like the more human side. So you have your marks to represent your 7 classes of data. Then you have to split up your data. How are you going to bin your data? And sort of that's like sort of a discussion. And once again, I arrive at sort of a custom solution to best preserve the landforms. And then you have to actually geographically bin them, because I have pixels and I don't have that many pixels. And so these pixels have to represent not only their area, but they have to connect to one another and tell a story. And so what I see when I see this map is I see a story of different geographic land flows. And so everything I'm describing took months to sort of work out. And there's probably a more technical discussion that could sort of expose the practice. But I'm so happy that David Rumsey, he saw it early preview, and he asked if he could collect it. And then since it's has been published, I've been approached by another couple institutions to do more of this kind of work. So this is sort of the new toy.
Well, that's amazing. Okay, yeah. Thank you. I think that was all we have.
Okay, let's go back to Florence Nightingale. Again, with sort of a focus on government data, is that Florence Nightingale, if you don't know her story, I don't know, she's famous for being a nurse. She goes to the Crimean War. in the mid 1850s. It's a real disaster in multiple dimensions. She's exposed to an enormous amount of suffering. Here's her main hospital. She worked not as a nurse. She worked as a nursing administrator across an entire hospital network. So she's responsible for many different sites. And so as an administrator, she's working with a lot of data all the time. Now, the data that she's working with, is administrative data during the war. And after the war, she becomes a reformer, really a sort of, superhuman crusader, unlike anybody that we have today. And unlike anybody that we've ever had. She's a really singular and particularly interesting person, both in her personality, but also in what she was able to accomplish. That's why we've been talking about her nonstop since about 1854. So after the war, she returns home, and she starts working with data, but the data she works with when she returns is not the data she produced at war. The data she works with when she returns home is mortality data. And just like the war was a mess across a lot of dimensions, the mortality data is a mess too. Here's sort of what it looks like. Okay, so this is one example. Now, what you see is, it's hand ruled and hand filled out. And these two different examples are on different sheets of paper in totally different formats. Here's another one. Well, why don't we do landscape? And here's another one. And, this data is all a mess. And so the army was a mess, and how the army operated was a mess, and how the army recorded and centralized its data was a mess. And even while she was at war, Florence Nightingale recognized this, complained about this, wanted to reform this. Part of her achievement is not just winning a variety of reforms that improved the health of the army and eventually the health of the whole British citizenry. Part of her early success was achieving all sorts of reforms in the way that data was recorded and centralized and normalized. And so we can sort of, see a little bit of the product of some of her fruits, the products that I'm most interested in, which is her information graphics. The context, she returns home from war, and the context is this. Basically, there's a lot of bickering and fighting in official rooms about what went wrong, who was responsible, what are we going to do about it. And Nightingale and her colleagues were really, really desperately afraid that all of the things they figured out while at war were going to be lost, and that the British Army was going to march into India, and it was going to be a calamity of an even greater magnitude than their Crimean War. And so Nightingale has this very sort of British Army focused attention. But while in London after returning from the war, she's introduced at a dinner party to William Farr. And William Farr is this superstar government statistician. And what William Farr has is a database. And the database looks like this. And so this is, if you know London, this is beneath Somerset House. It is a climate-controlled, gas-lit record of decades worth of essentially, what we sort of would think of as sort of like census data, but it's when it's a government register office data of who, when people were born, when they were married, and when they died. And so they're just, thousands of volumes that go on for miles beneath the city of London in these beautiful vaults. And, this is an enormous wave of data, that I sort of alluded to earlier when I said the French did it first and then the British sort of, followed suit. William Farr is not only responsible for maintaining and making some sense from all this data, he's actually responsible for the data. He was there, creating this giant wave of data and slowly year after year improving its quality. And so Nightingale and Farr meet each other. He gives her a tour of this data, and sort of all the light bulbs go off. She understands that the army data has to, has to reach the same sort of quality as all the civilian data. But even more importantly is she understands that, I can make this comparison to how horrible the army is and put that in context for people by comparing it to the civilian data. And so Farr, and a group of other people that are sometimes called Nightingale Circle, I call them the reformers, they worked together for several years to to impress upon not only the public, but all sorts of people in power, in parliament, the royals, military officers. In the central comparison, the big thing they always return to is comparing Nightingale's military data to Farr's civilian data. Okay, so how do they do that? They do that with information graphics. And not only do they do that with information graphics, they do that with exceptionally well-produced information graphics. And so Nightingale is investing part of her family's fortune into making these colorful graphics. And what's really amazing is that through our research, we're able to highlight some of, or able to, pull out of the archives some of the surviving drafts. And, I'm somebody who's sort of obsessed. I'm sort of somebody who's obsessed with craft and how things are actually made and why design decisions are made. And the big idea behind these drafts is they show us the collaborative effort. They show us how they work together, how these teams, teams of, a dozen more people work together on these information graphics led by Nightingale. And one of the things that studying the history also shows us is that a lot of these graphics that Nightingale led and produced were actually influenced by earlier charts by William Farr. And so you can see, life tables, and you can see density plots that are similar to, Farr's earlier publications. And you can see how Nightingale saw a bar chart and she's like, I want to make bar charts. And she, in almost all of these cases, she keeps elevating the form. She sees something, she likes it, and she does it even better. And so, we don't have enough time to kind of examine every chart, but she is particularly famous for one circular diagram. That's what she called it. She called it a circular diagram. And that started also referencing a William Farr graphic, which oddly enough referenced a Gary graphic from the 1820s. And so there is this sort of tradition of people riffing and improving on designs. And the idea is that you have mortality going around a circle, which each spoke representing, I believe, a different month here. And you have different causes of mortality in different colors. And the problem is that there's an encoding issue with this chart. And the issue is that and here's a variant of it. Again, we're looking at drafts here. Here's the Farr piece that they're referencing. What's really great is like we know that they're collaborating. We know these charts look similar, but we don't have to make the leap that Nightingale is referencing Farr's, because if you read the draft, you can actually see that it's directly referenced on the draft. And so, I mean, as a historian of design, having these sort of insights is just really, really spectacular. But there is a problem with this chart. What's the problem? The problem is that the chart encodes data, along those spokes. And then somebody came along, they filled in all the area, and your attention doesn't go to the length of each of those spokes. Your eye goes into the area that's being filled. And so it's sort of exaggerating that really, really big month at the bottom of the graphic. And so there's sort of a technical problem with this chart that, whether or not they're aware of it when it's published, they published it anyway. These charts are published in a lot of different places. So they're published in a government report that sort of looks like this and folds out. And then Nightingale takes in the government report it's like something like 800 pages long. And these charts are fold outs and they're beautiful, they're colorful, but they're in the middle of an 800-page book. Who the heck's going to read that? And so she also publishes them in a very slim, elegantly produced folio, which has the same sort of blue color paper as a front. So it looks like an official report, even though it's not. And so she and her colleagues are circulating this other report with the same graphics in them. There's a whole bunch of graphics. And, we can flip through them, I think, rather quickly to give you a flavor of what Nightingale's all about, and what she and Farr are producing with their teams. Beautiful bar charts. And of course, these polar diagrams, what they called circular diagrams. But they did realize that they had this technical error, and they realized it because other people realized it, and other people were complaining. And so they issue an errata note. Here's the errata note. They say, hey, don't read it like that. But lucky for them, they get a second bite at the apple. And so later, several months later, they get an opportunity to reimagine this chart. And that is actually how we arrive to these drafts where the area now encodes the data value. And you can see that these It's a little bit smoother. It's a little bit more attractive. And finally, these are also published in a variety of places as a series. And so I want to pause here because this is the most famous and iconic Nightingale information graphic. And if you know her work at all, you probably know the central image, the colorful image. That's diagrams of the causes of mortality. So on the left is sort of Act 1. That's the diagram of mortality. What you see on the left is sort of like, look at all the people who are dying. And the second chart is like, hey, here's how they're dying. And then the third chart, what it shows you is like, here's how we know how to stop them from dying. And so it's a really great 1, 2, 3 act play. And it's meant to be read together, not only just with the charts, but also with Nightingale's accompanying text and statistical tables. The text, the tables, and the charts all work together. Once again, these are all published. First privately, and then some of Nightingale's antagonists published charts. When people see Nightingale's charts, when they see this chart, one of the common complaints is, "Oh, it should have been a line chart." Well, guess what? Her antagonists published line charts. They look like this. We don't know about these. These are not as successful, not because they're incorrect charts, but because nobody really pays attention to them. They're not as interesting. And so having an interesting visual that people pay attention to is important. These antagonist charts are important because they encourage Nightingale to go public once again and make a big folio, make a big presentation. It's so big that you don't have to fold the charts into the publication anymore. And she finally, the third place that this chart is published is in a little red book that is meant for the soldiers to actually consume. And so the red book is sort of a narrative chronicle of the war called England and Her Soldiers. And so this and quite a lot more, again, this is a book talk. And so this and quite a lot more is in the book. And, I will highlight in the lower left-hand images, we have not only replicated and color matched all of the incomplete catalog of Nightingale's charts, but we have these very complicated foldouts, these two-part foldouts that fold out in the exact same way as the originals did. These foldouts not only had to be folded by hand, but also tipped into our publication by hand. So that is a very quick tour of Nightingale. I think this is another good time to stop for a question or two, or maybe a little bit of discussion before we march on.
Thanks, RJ. There's no questions that I see, but Michael said that the early Florence Nightingale drafts and their story is a key historical discovery. I agree. Well, I'm just fascinated by history. But anyway, I was wondering, do we have a sense of, or what is the sense of how much William Farr contributed to the graphics and Florence contributed to the graphic? I mean, was it
enormously so? Yeah. So we have a really good sense. And so there is a third leg of this stool. Okay. So I think the big idea is that technically this is impossible without Farr. Not only does he bring sort of all of his statistical talents and the know-how, having produced data visualization, in multiple publications beforehand, he also brings an army of government clerks who actually, have the know-how to produce these things and to actually draw them, right? Farr and Nightingale are not drawing them. Although I did find evidence that Nightingale, is a visual thinker, and that she, in her correspondence, she would make little diagrams. Okay, but no, we found all the names of the clerks who actually drew these things, and were able to connect. Some of these are the same clerks who drew previous data visualization. And so there is a large team working on these. You can think of like a journalism metaphor where Farr is sort of like running a service desk, and Nightingale is kind of like the star reporter. That's one way of thinking about it. One way that I think about it is that we see what Farr's data visualization is like before Nightingale. And Nightingale's entry raises his art and his craft to another level, to a level that, he was not possible of achieving, by himself. And then, and this is in the narrative inside the book, but we can actually go into some of their correspondence and, better understand their differentiated roles, and also understand how they collaborated. And so sometimes they would work together through correspondence, but often they would just visit each other. One of the things that's really amazing is that all these people who worked on these things are right in central London. And so they would just, they were as booked as we are. I mean, they would schedule their time in 30-minute increments, and, have several deliveries of mail. Sometimes they would send couriers with drafts, with notes, I need, mark this up now and send it right back, and this is the only copy we have. And Nightingale, was sometimes very sly, and she'd ask to, see some data that she was curious about, and then why she had it, she'd copy it feverishly before returning it. So there's, the human sort of aspect is, I believe it's thoroughly cinematic.
Well, it is rather impressive, especially at the time, for a woman to be involved in something like that. I think so. It's kind of amazing from that standpoint too. But just the fact that these two people, this group of people, kind of came together and produced this amazing work.
So I mean, Nightingale's the only female member of, the team working on these information graphics, but we should remember that she had a primary audience of a single person, who is the Queen Victoria. And so Queen Victoria is just sort of this counterpoint, powerful personality that Nightingale is very conscious of. They meet in person. Nightingale is sending all these information graphics, went right to the team. Nightingale listed out all the names of all the people that these were destined for. The Queen is number one. And so there is another kind of like, polar sort of, or anti-polar sort of woman in the story. And also Nightingale is correspondence is not only with men. She's writing to several women colleagues and friends, and she does not pull any statistical punches. These people are literate. They knew numbers, and Nightingale's correspondence is statistically complex. And again, no matter who's hearing it. So yes, Nightingale is a unique feminist figure. Deliberately so. This is something she deliberately chose to do with her life, is to sort of basically not be a housewife. And she's like, I can't accomplish what I want to do if I'm a housewife. And so she turns her back on all of that, and dedicates herself to an impressively religious life. So okay, we could talk forever about Nightingale. Do we want to hit Emma Willard before we close, though?
Yes, I would love to hear more about Emma Willard. I'm not sure, but I suspect many in the audience have not heard of Emma.
Oh my goodness. Well, today's a great day for you.
Okay.
Because Emma Willard's really, really fantastic. And so I edited and wrote the essay in the Nightingale volume. Our Emma Willard volume is, and here's Emma. Our Emma Willard volume is edited by Susan Schulten, who's professor of history, and at Denver University. And so Schulten and I have geeked out for years on Emma Willard. And Emma Willard has sort of like a really, so here's, we also have a fold out in this book. And Emma Willard, just like Nightingale has one kind of iconic graphic, Emma Willard also has sort of one iconic graphic, and it's called the Temple of Time. Here it is. The Temple of Time is a visual history. And this is how it works. The distant past is all the way at the back of the temple, and today is all the way at the front of the temple. And each column represents a century. So this was published in 1846. So this is published about a decade before all of the Nightingale story. And what's really, really wonderful is, like, it's today because the column at the very front, they're only half finished because we're only halfway through the 19th century when this is published. And so what I love about this temple is that we have the perfect metaphor for time, because we are all blind to the future. Our backs face the future, right? And and then we can peer into the past. We know the past, but the past gets less detailed, a little bit more blurry as we look backward. And so this is a beautiful metaphor for time. And so the question is, like, who the heck is Emma Willard, and how did she create this, and why did she create this? And there's like all these questions about, like, how did this image come to be? And so that is what the volume sets out to answer, and particularly because we have Susan Schulten writing the essay and collaborating with me on all the research into all the different graphics. We deliver a rather spectacular answer. So Emma Willard was an educator, and particularly she's known in America also as a feminist, as an educator of women, young women. And so Emma Willard, as part of her education, she begins in the early 1820s publishing textbooks and publishing atlases. And so, her early work is sort of like mostly pretty normal. Like you could see a double planisphere like this, like, probably any atlas. But even very, very early on, she's experimenting. Again, here's that word, experimenting, with weird forms. And here's a map of the Amazon River, and overlaid on the map of the Amazon River, she's put the history of ancient Rome. So here's the progress of the Roman Empire laid over the Amazon River. She also very early on has a history of America. And so the history of America is very interesting because it acknowledges the pre-colonial history that, not only were Native Americans here, but these indigenous peoples actually had a whole history and life to themselves. They moved around, right? And that there is a history before the colonials arrived. But then, of course, the colonials do arrive in 1620. And so, again, this is one of Emma Willard's early atlases, an atlas of America. And what's so interesting about this atlas is, if we go into the detail, she acknowledges that date, which has now, now become so infamous, as 1619, first arrival of slaves. Emma Willard, through the 1820s, makes atlases, makes textbooks, and the textbook is a very competitive market. And so Emma Willard is operating under sort of like two competitive pressures. One is the market for textbooks. Eventually, she would sell over 1 million textbooks in her life. So this is a real operation. 1 million books, wow! But also, she's an actual teacher, not only teacher, but she's founding various academies for girls. One which still survives, famously, Emma Willard School in Troy, New York. So she sort of has a sense of what actually works in the classroom and what students need. But then she also has a sense or a demand on her craft to actually produce stuff that people are going to buy. And so those two forces motivate her to do all this kind of wild experimentation. And so we have tree histories, we have flows. And so this is from an atlas, but then, there's a miniature version that's put into a textbook that looks kind of like this. And then again, this is just amazing that we have this kind of stuff, is that we have, a copy from a student. And so this is what the student, copied from the atlas, and, likely copied from memory, because that's how things often were done. And, if you look at the floor of the Temple of Time, then you'll notice a similar sort of flow of history pattern. And what we realize is that Emma Willard, didn't just make a temple of time. She made several temples of time, one of which we discovered as part of our research for this book, a temple of time that's devoted to the history of England, a temple of time related to ancient history. The conclusion of Emma Willard's career was in the 1850s, when the United States was falling apart. Emma Willard was a nationalist. She was a patriot. She really like many, saw the nation coming apart as it descended towards civil war, and she did everything she could to sort of prop up the nation graphically. And one of the maps that endures from her work is a map of America. And so this idea we have in our head, this meme of the contiguous United States, is something that Emma Willard practically invents. And here is a particular form that shows the progress from the original 13 colonies to the various territorial acquisitions through the country's history from sea to shining sea. The book concludes at the very end with a graphic catalog where you can actually see how big these things are related to one another. And then Emma Willard, just like Florence Nightingale published her graphics in the same graphic might appear in a couple different publications. Emma Willard, you have, in some of her textbooks, dozens of printings, dozens of editions. And so we did our best with what's surviving to put together exactly, where were these images published in this graphic timeline. So that is the Emma Willard book. But the last stinger on the Emma Willard book is that we really wanted people to appreciate the Temple of Time. And the thing is that you cannot appreciate it through Zoom right now. You cannot appreciate it on your phone. Why? Because this thing is big. It's like really, really big. And so the very last thing in the book is a inserted poster of the Temple of Time. And so everybody who gets the Emma Willard book gets a copy of the Temple of Time. And it's like I said, I don't should I unfold it? It's large, right? Like that's the point. Is like this thing is it's really big. Size? Oh yeah, absolutely. Not only original size, but we have these very we have these fine printers outside of Venice, and so they would send us color proofs, and then I would go to the actual original that we used at Stanford, and that's how we did our color correction. So this is as good as it's going to get. And these things were actually used. They're in the classroom, which means not many have survived. These things were not put away and tucked away gently. There's not very many of these, and so this is the best way that you can actually experience Emma Willard's Temple of Time. Do we have? I see maybe one more question.
Yes, there is a question in the chat. Not the chat. I mean the Q&A. Do you want me to read it, or you could read it?
Yeah.
Okay. What are the values or parameters you take into account when translating data into an infographic? If mathematical precision is not as important as the message, how do you balance art with accuracy when, unfortunately, graphics are sometimes used to distort the true distribution of the data?
I'm usually not all communication is going to be, the goal is to warp somebody's attention. Essentially. And so that's what you're doing. That's the practice. If you're going to be in a communication art, whether you're writing the abstract to a scientific paper or something else, you're trying to attract people's attention and get them, to see your world in a particular way. I wrote a whole book about that. It's called Info We Trust. And so it's all about trust. And this is I'm currently working on the next edition, which we're gonna call it the remastered edition of Info We Trust. And so this is a pretty broad, persuasive statistics and persuasive maps is sort of a whole field. Emma Willard made charts because she wanted to educate people, but she was, persuading people to a very particular nationalistic American sort of jingoistic, almost view of the world and view of America and view of the different people in America and who's an American. It's really interesting after the Mexican-American War, she's there's all these Spanish speaking people, who are now in America. And, she starts publishing her textbooks in Spanish and her maps in Spanish because those are Americans. She also does something in German because there's a bunch of German speaking Americans. And so, whenever we're engaging with the world, we're saying, here's my model of understanding. and, does that help you navigate the complex of, chaos of reality? And that doesn't mean you're going to do it, perfectly well. I mean, perfect is not, it's just not a thing. You can always do something a little bit better, right? And that's what we're all trying to do. And so you try to approach the craft, with a little bit of integrity and honesty and transparency. But the thing is that, this is like sort of Roosevelt's man in the arena. The people who are doing this, at least they're trying to do something and trying to help people understand the world better. Now, Nightingale was even more persuasive than Willard. Nightingale had a like a surgical strike sort of attitude towards what these graphics were doing. And here's the big idea. The big idea is that if you looked at the Crimea War and what a disaster it was, there were, many, maybe dozens of reforms necessary. The problem is you can't go to Parliament and say, here are the 20 things you need to do. Like that's not how our lizard brains work. And that's not how our lizard brains work when we look at an image or read text. Basically we can consume one or maybe a couple things at a time. That's it. That's all you get. And so, yeah, when you're trying to make a connection, and we are a social species, and the connection is sort of like the most important, but also the most difficult thing, then yeah, you only get to present one or maybe a couple things at once. And if you can only do that, that means that you have to leave the rest of the chaos of reality behind. But like, I don't know any better way to do it. What you do otherwise is where we started. You make a big interactive, like that history explorer that I made, and you dump it on somebody and say, hey, you figure it out. You do the hard work. And guess what? Nobody's going to do it. And you're not going to make a difference. So if you want to make a difference, then you swallow the pill and you say, I'm going to give a narrow, focused view of reality. And you're going to do it over and over and over again. Because saying the thing once isn't enough. You have to repeat it over and over and over. And that's one of the things that Nightingale, particularly her story, is the ability to sustain an effort over several years in order to accomplish, your mission. So I'm going to hang out for a while as long as people want to keep talking. I know that we're approaching an hour. I want to give, Wendy an opportunity to, I don't know if you have anything that you need to close down, but please do check out the books. They're on sale at visionarypress.com. And we're shipping today. So I'm looking forward to hearing what everybody thinks about them.
Yeah, thank you. I have to go check out that poster. I have to admit I haven't unrolled it. So. But this is just amazing, and I know there's still a third one that we haven't talked about. So maybe I could convince you in the future to give us a talk on Murray, because I've never heard of him before. So I'm looking forward to learning something new. But just two quick things that sort of resonate in my mind. First is that I can't believe Emma Willard sold so many textbooks. That's incredible.
It's a lot. Well, she was, she started publishing in the early 1820s and went through the 1860s, and the reconfigure of the nation combined with her age, sort of after the Civil War, sort of other people kind of took over. That's still, that's a 40-year career. Of pumping out books. So no, it's really impressive. And her books, I mean, you can still go on eBay and get her books pretty cheap. The problem is getting one in good condition. The thing is, these are textbooks that they were used by kids and, written all over and, passed through, the families or passed through the classroom over multiple years. So
that's amazing. And the other, I guess I'll just end with this one, is that, and I think you alluded to this, that what's kind of amazing about what Florence Nightingale and William Farr did was that the results of their use of data and visualizing it produced change, right? I mean, real change. And saved lives.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's hard to understand the impact of the sanitary movement, let alone like, how do you quantify that? You can quantify that. Some people say they saved 1 billion lives. And that's a lot. So, I mean, let's assume that the sanitary movement saved 1 billion lives. Well, Florence Nightingale was a leader, not the leader, but a leader in the sanitary movement for a portion of its history. So how many of those 1 billion lives do you ascribe to Florence Nightingale? And, you know, and say you could do that. Well, how many lives do you ascribe to one of her publications? And then how many lives do you ascribe to one of the charts in one of her publications? Like, the thing is, it's a total integrated complex package. And so, you know, we sort of wrestle with, like, you know, how valuable were these things? What are the reforms that they directly resulted in? That's included in the discussion at the very end of the Nightingale essay in the book. But it's difficult to unpack. One of the things that, you know, sort of that like encourages me that these things were valuable is that they kept making them and they kept using them. You know, they were valuable to the makers, and they saw worth in them. You know, even today, I'm a practicing data storyteller. I make maps, charts, and diagrams, you know, for all kinds of different clients. And I don't know if my work is good. Like, the best feedback I get is when they rehire me. And it's like if I get rehired, then I must have done something right, and they must have seen some value in it. But it's a very slow feedback loop, right? It might take years for me to be rehired. You know, they have another use for me, but it's a very honest feedback loop.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's true. And you're honest and realistic and productive too. So, all right. Well, thank you so much, RJ. And I'm sorry we're not in person. You can't hear the applause, but I'm sure everybody's out there giving you some applause. And I know I certainly am here.
Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And yeah, well, we'll be in touch. Maybe we could do this again.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Wendy.
You're
so long,
welcome.
everyone.
Take care. Thank you. Thanks all. Bye.